So I'd like to call on John Jack, who is one of my fellow citizens of the Huu-ay-aht First Nation. John is, I'm going to ask him to introduce himself a little bit here while I pull up his presentation. I'm really happy to have John here. He is someone who has been a constant member of our council since pre-treaty and into our new treaty world. John has served 3 terms as an executive council member. As I say, he served before treaty and he continues to serve in our post-treaty governments. John is somebody I'm really proud of. He came to us at a very young age, straight out of university, with all the answers for us. So we're really glad to have him. He soon found out that he had a bit to learn and has gone and done exceedingly well in doing that, in terms of being a very strong leader in our community, of showing our youth that we can be leaders and that you can come into our community and make a positive impact. I'm so impressed. I'm always really glad to spend time with John. We have some great discussions. Really glad that he was able to join us here today. He's got a lot of accomplishments since. He also sits as a member of a full member on behalf of our nation of the Alberni-Clayoquot Regional District, and holds the treaty implementation portfolio among many others within our nation. So very pleased to welcome John Jack.
Thank you, Angela. So I'd just like to acknowledge the fact that we're able to do our business on the territory of the Coast Salish First Nations, so it's always great to be here. I'd like to thank Angela for her introduction, and I think I will state that it's one of the most important lessons I learned in my education, but also in my experience, is that true wisdom is knowing what you don't know, and a whole world of ignorance was opened up to me once I started. So it's a learning process no matter what. So first off, I'd like to apologize to the Maa-nulth Treaty Society. I did not have a Maa-nulth template for the presentation, so I used the Huu-ay-aht one. So incidentally, this is a picture of our ancient capital, Keegan, on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It's specifically a photo of Execution Rock, which performed a very important political and law enforcement function, as well as being a bit of a bastion whenever our nation was under attack. So this is me. Because Angela did in fact introduce me, I will just direct you to the very bottom and ask if you have Twitter. If you don't have Twitter, you should get it. And once you get it, you should subscribe to the BC Treaty Commission, but you should also check me out. I'm at Garakias, which is an old video game name that just kind of stuck with me. So yeah, I'm a third-term councillor with the Huu-ay-aht First Nations, and the reason why I'm here is because I have some insight into how the Maa-nulth experience might affect your experience. So we have several points of discussion. We have the West Coast context, kind of leading up to the Maa-nulth treaty process, which will include the new Maa-nulth Agreement in principle. We'll have a discussion specifically about the Maa-nulth Treaty experience, as well as the internal matters of governance that were dealt with by the Maa-nulth Treaty Society. So we're a multi-community treaty, and how that gets structured and set up will be unique across all treaty tables, but I'll give you information in regards to the considerations that we took into account. And we also talked about the shared initiatives that we all took part in, as well as the items that we were working together on, not just in the negotiation, but also in the post-ratification implementation stage. And then I'll talk about how we can make it work and what's important there. So New Maa-nulth is both a description of a culture grouping on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It's 14 individual First Nations. The best description I can state is that New Maa-nulth, which used to be called the Nootka, erroneously, is a lot like ancient Greece, if you think about it. You know, they speak the same language, they have the same traditional knowledge, but they're uniquely different political organizations that sometimes were at odds with each other in the past. That's different now, but it's an important historical context to put forward so that we can really understand historically where we came from before contact. New Maa-nulth is also often a short form description of the organization of us coming together in the New Maa-nulth Tribal Council, so sometimes you'll hear that being used. Maa-nulth is actually both a reference to the Maa-nulth Final Agreement, or the treaty, as well as the First Nations of the Maa-nulth Treaty Society, the grouping of 5 Maa-nulth First Nations that came together to pursue treaty. If you ever hear anybody refer to Maa-nulth as Maa-nulth, please correct them. It's very wrong, but it's often something that happens. So to go back in time about 2 decades, the New Maa-nulth Tribal Council was in the process of negotiating with the Crown and made it to the agreement in principle stage. The AIP was not universally accepted. In fact, a number of First Nations were interested in pursuing treaty. In fact, in particular, 5 First Nations wanted to move ahead. There were more First Nations that do and are moving ahead, but this is a Maa-nulth treaty presentation. So the 5 First Nations that joined together to negotiate with the Crown called themselves the First Nations of the Maa-nulth Treaty Society. So there's 5 First Nations, and I listed them alphabetically. First is the Hawaiian First Nations. I would note that it's plural for kind of traditional reasons. And the Cayuga-Checklisset First Nations, who use the regular script to kind of state what their name is. There's the Toquat Nation, as well as the Ho-Chuklisset tribe. Finally, we have the Ukluklit First Nation. So one thing I'll state is the word Ot, or is actually our word for people. So it's basically Ho'ai, people of Ho'ai, or people of Ukluklit, the word Ukluklit, so the town of Ukluklit. But I would also note one thing is that we all have our own different names and nomenclature when it comes to our own governments, and I find this very important when it comes to self-identifying and really becoming our own communities. So we call ourselves Hawaiian First Nations, but the Toquat call themselves the Toquat Nation. The Ho-Chuklisset call themselves the Ho-Chuklisset tribe. Now these are all self-selected names, and it's a lot better than Indian band. We're taking control of our identity, and that's the first step in true self-governance. Anyway, so the Maa-nulth Treaty was structured to negotiate between the 5 First Nations under the auspices of the Maa-nulth Treaty Society and the Crown governments, the federal and provincial governments. So there were joint negotiations, both collective and individual, almost always at the same time, but I'll go into more detail about that later. All 5 member nations were represented at an internal table, but they also went to the larger tripartite table working with a chief negotiator. So at the time of negotiations, the Maa-nulth Treaty Society employed an administrator, as well as support staff, chief negotiator, and legal counsel. Each individual member nation was treated as an independent body. They did have to make decisions on their own and participate meaningfully in negotiations and preparations for negotiations. So there was a degree of autonomy figured into the entire arrangement. Shared initiatives would be jointly developed, organized, and paid for according to an agreement beforehand. So when the Maa-nulth Treaty Society came together, it was organized in such a way that it was a bit of an alliance where money would be pooled together and decisions would be made on how that joint money would be used for the good of everyone. Now, while the Maa-nulth Final Agreement is one binding document on 2 Crown governments and 5 First Nations, there's a strong degree of autonomy within those member nations. So each of those member nations, the 5 that I listed, are self-governing. They own and control their own lands and resources. They have their individual identities, politics, and culture. And we each have our own individual constitution, suite of laws, regulations, policies, and our own public services or administrations or bureaucracies, whichever you'd like to call them. Usually it's based on how angry or happy I am with them at any time. The first governance model, however, was actually contemplated to be a lot more centralized. So following the idea that we would work together more and more often, that some of our autonomy or sovereignty would be pooled into and seen as a stronger force for lobbying the Crown governments or so on and so forth. This was later changed when we realized that we had really disparate geography. 4 of the Maa-nulth First Nations were situated in and around Barkley Sound, but one was very far to the north of Vancouver Island in the Cayuga-Cheklicet area, Cayuga Sound. And we had different demographics. Some of the First Nations were quite small, others were quite large. And we had different political cultures within the community, as well as different set of expectations with our leaders. So if we were to centralize any of our decision-making authority, we would find ourselves in the same situation that Canada finds itself in today and found themselves in 1867. Coming together with such disparate communities wasn't necessarily what we wanted to do here and now. So that being said, the structure of each First Nations government is markedly different. As a part of the treaty, each government had to be essentially democratic in some way, shape, or form. But how that is expressed varies among those 5 First Nations. A good example of that is how hereditary leadership is involved or not involved in government decision-making, either direct, advisory, or somewhere in between. So I don't personally know too much about other First Nations, so I can only really show you the Hawaiian example. So the Hawaiian example is that somewhere in between. So we do recognize that we do have hereditary leaderships, numbering in 7 individuals, but they're regarded as an advisory body who appoint 1 representative to sit on council, who sits with the same voting abilities as a single councillor. Our main part of our government is the Hawaiian First Nations Council. It's 5 elected councillors, 1 appointed councillor, and 1 elected chief councillor. And so they deliberate both as the executive council in a month-to-month basis, as well as our legislative body, which puts forward our acts of government, most notably the Budget Act, but also any changes to our 20-plus suite of laws and policies, or 20-plus acts of government that we have on our website. There are different functions that are performed by different bodies within our government. And I have already talked about the hereditary leadership, which is on the upper right of that particular document. But we do have standing committees, one of which is treaty implementation, another is citizenship, another is economic development, and then the last is finance. These are standing committees. They're mandated actually by law to exist. But we also have several other types of committees that are very important as well. We have an education, trades, and training committee. We have a kind of a natural resources and land use committee. We have all those types of things. We have citizen development committee. So these are special committees, and they're advisory bodies that give advice to the government to make decisions. We also have something called the Tribunal. So the Hawaiian Tribunal is actually kind of our Supreme Court. It performs 2 functions. It ensures that all of the acts of government and decisions of government are within the strictures of the Constitution that we passed, but also just fits with our suite of laws and policies. It is also a bit of an administrative tribunal. When decisions are made internally that weren't done according to law, a complaint can be made and it can be rectified. And last, but certainly not least, is our People's Assembly. So I don't need to talk to you about how band meetings go, and this is the same template. However, our People's Assembly is an advisory body, except in instances where they are given direct decision-making authority, either by law, such as selecting an auditor or certain representatives of the tribunal, or advisory powers, where a government can ask for the people to give them feedback on something, or citizens can bring something to the floor to make a recommendation. Usually those are purely recommendations, and the government would act on them if they so choose. They're non-binding. Of course, we have a professional administration that would carry out the services and programs that would be created or contemplated by any law or policy that we enact. But back to Maa-nulth, because that's the Hawaiian example. How each First Nation within the Maa-nulth Treaty Society completely, it's wide open how they want to do things. Some of our constitutions are similar, but the structure can be different. For example, one of the First Nations within Maa-nulth directly involves their hereditary leaders, and therefore the way that elections are held and the way that proceedings are done is quite a bit different from how we do it. But I did say back to Maa-nulth. So we worked together on certain initiatives, and I guess first and foremost was how we went about negotiating the treaty. So when the 5 First Nations came together, they identified a need for a chief negotiator. And our first chief negotiator was actually George Watts, who was from the Tishat First Nation, but was very good at bringing us together and keeping us on task. Unfortunately, George Watts passed away, and Gary Yabsley, our legal counsel at the time, was chosen to be the new chief negotiator. So he took us into the actual ratification and implementation stage. We also had an administrator that just kept watch and made sure that the monies that were pulled together were administered correctly, and plus an assistant from time to time, or now permanently. So it was originally Vic Pearson, but now it's Chuck Potionrider. We had legal counsel. I say 1+ there because we did have one company, Ratcliffe, but we also had many, many lawyers at any one time helping us out with drafting, with negotiating, with research, and so on and so forth. The member nations' representatives were involved at every stage, however, so that it wasn't a centralizing power, and in effect, every First Nation was expected to participate meaningfully and keep up with what was going on. So they were at every internal meeting, and they would go to every tripartite actual main table negotiation. And of course, any number of staff, either employed by Maa-nulth directly or by each First Nation, would often be involved as well. And that's where I came in back in 2007. So we also had other topics that were specific to negotiation. And I don't want to belabor the point, but a lot of it had to do with fish because of the people we are. We depend on salmon and other forms of fish in order to make sure that we move ahead. So salmon and ocean resources were the basis of our economy, and therefore of central importance to us economically, but also traditionally. That being said, it's one of the most confusing things that I've ever been involved with. I was not raised to know about fisheries, so it's a bit of a behind-the-8-ball experience for me. We did talk about wildlife and timber and non-timber resources, as well as other treaty-related measures where several or all would work collectively on developing this particular aspect or that particular aspect. We also worked together on ratification to some degree to make sure that we had a collective approach to how we would administer and how we would legally participate together in certain things. Importantly as well, we talked about jointly how we would develop the communications on ratification, because it was important that not only we find and enroll or register to vote as many potential members or citizens of each First Nation, but that they would be presented with fair, accurate, and meaningful information to make an informed vote. The aim of the Maa-nulth Treaty Society at the time was to make sure that everybody didn't vote because they didn't know enough, but rather that they had the information to make a principled choice in support or not in support of the treaty. So incidentally, back then, one of the jobs I did was eligibility and enrollment, which was actually handled by the Maa-nulth Treaty Society, because treaty enrollment is what you needed to have in order to be able to vote for or against the treaty. And therefore, it was governed by those treaty processes rather than internal to each First Nation. That being said, there was a lot of coordination involved between each of the 5 to make sure that it was done in a way that was acceptable to each community. So we find ourselves in a post-ratification implementation stage. So I say it like that because it really matters. I believe there should be a pre-ratification implementation stage, but that feels like it should be its own forum. So what Maa-nulth does now is that we make sure that we maintain the society, an administrator, an assistant, and legal counsel, and that we participate meaningfully in the Tripartite Implementation Committee, which is a group that represents Maa-nulth, federal, and provincial interests at one main table to make sure that the treaty is being carried out correctly. The definition of correctly is often the point of contention, but it is a place where we can do that. So it does have a very good function. Like the main table negotiations, each First Nation is invited and directly involved in how that goes about, and therefore no First Nation is left out of the loop. We also work together with the federal government, the provincial government, sometimes one-off, sometimes together, on various joint initiatives or specific topics. Thank you. Fisheries, traditional harvesting, wildlife management, joint enforcement of laws, and so on and so forth, all things that matter specifically, and all things that need specific attention. Because we have the ability to do a thing doesn't mean we have necessarily right now the framework to do that or the resources to do that. So somebody needs to work on it, and that's what those groups are for. So I think this is where I kind of lead into what Satsan was talking about in several ways. But this is a new relationship. The whole thing is a new relationship. Internally, with our own people. We're a self-governing First Nation now. Externally, with the Crown. Externally, with other neighboring First Nations, and externally with even other regional or municipal governments. All of those relationships are going to take work, but they're on a different footing. We're not wards of the state anymore, or the Crown. We're self-governing, meaningfully independent groups and communities. And that's really important to note. And I would say that at least one individual was jumping up and down the moment that treaty was signed, and he's sitting right there. So Tom Happynick was like easily one of the most enthusiastic individuals when it came to becoming self-governing First Nation. But one thing that Satsan did talk about that I'd like to tie in is kind of why I think people like us do this. And so this is a picture I actually got from Tom Happynook. This is my great-great-grandmother. So this is Kakacha. She lived to be over 100 years old, and this photo was taken late 20s, early 30s. And her English name was Lucille. So she was married to Old Man Jack, whose name escapes me at the moment, his real name. But the way that it works is you take the first English name of the patriarch of the family, and that becomes the last name of the family. So this is our namesake. This is who it is. So Kakacha, late 20s, early 30s, over 100 years old. So this is Jackson Jack and Maggie Coots. These are my great-grandparents. So the photo was taken about the same time. This is my grandfather. He was born in 1927. He's the oldest man in the tribe. And I actually have a point to this. He lives in Parksville with my uncle. This is my grandfather holding his great-granddaughter. So the reason why I do this, and the reason why I hope you all do this, is because she's going to be the first woman in my family, at least, to know and grow up in a self-governing First Nation. Since Kakacha, who was born probably in 1820. That's why I do this. And thank you.